Today I'll be talking about the foodways at Catoctin Furnace. I feel that food is something that connects all of us and can help us remember that these were individuals that needed to work to feed and provide for their families just like we do. Catoctin Furnace is located at the base of the Catoctin Mountains in northern Frederick County, Maryland. It was a charcoal-fired blast furnace that was in operation from 1776 to 1903. It began as a family-owned business in 1776 and was developed by Maryland's first governor, Thomas Johnson. It changed hands several times over the years, but managed to remain in operation for over 100 years. In the late 18th and early 19th centuries, between 15 and 20 stone or log houses were built. By 1888, there were 80 workers' cottages. Today, the village retains its original layout, and several historic structures remain through the efforts of the Historical Society. The historic structures include the church, 12 stone or log worker houses, the ruins of the iron furnaces, and the homes of the furnace owners. The lives of the individuals that worked there essentially revolved around the furnace. They lived in company housing, purchased goods from the company store, and went to a church provided by the company owner. The Forgeman's house, the site where close to 30,000 artifacts were uncovered, has been interpreted as a home of one of these furnace workers and their family. It was originally dated as being constructed in 1817, but further dendrochronological testing, or tree ring dating, gave us the more accurate year of 1820 or 1821. This is an image of what it looked like in the 1920s when it's already about 100 years old. This is how it appears after the most recent renovations. The overall goal with the restoration is to create a heritage tourism product. It is to become a bed and breakfast property that will produce a steady flow of income so that the Society can continue to maintain the historic structures and programs offered year-round. Now, it's undergone several renovations, but the one that required the excavation took place in March and April of 2016. However, artifacts began to emerge when preparing for the initial renovation. In 2016, for the large-scale excavation, here we can see one of our archaeologists working in the southwest corner of Test Unit 4. Test Unit 4 is where a majority of the artifacts were found. This concentration of artifacts could possibly be interpreted as this area of the home being a more communal space rather than a private one. For example, this may have been a sort of living room where the family would spend much of its time as well as where guests would be entertained. Not only have we interpreted that the northern half was a private area versus the southern half being more public, but we also believe that there was likely a loose floorboard in the southern half that contributed to the abundance of artifacts. A total of 29,385 artifacts were uncovered throughout the course of the excavation. Now, amongst these artifacts, there were some food waste that survived. Unfortunately, in this sort of location, not a lot of organic material will stand the test of time, but there are a few examples that remained, and in conjunction with historical documents and oral histories, we can begin to understand the foodways of these people. When trying to put all of this together, the primary questions that I focused on were what sorts of foods were they eating, where were they getting it from, and how were they making it last? At the time, it was not uncommon for families to have 8 or 9 kids, easily putting households into the double digits. How were they able to provide for the families on the wages of a laborer? I hope that I'll be able to convey the drive and resourcefulness of these individuals that was required to live in this iron-making community so that we can better understand who these people were. I'll begin by discussing the artifacts like this corn cob fragment here. Several corn cob fragments were found, and this was one of the items that was recorded as being purchased at the company store. Several different types of nuts and their shells were uncovered, including black walnuts, butternuts, and English walnuts, as well as shells from hickory nuts, chestnuts, almonds, and peanuts, which we know aren't actually nuts. Now, it is possible that some of these may have occurred naturally, but foraging is discussed in the oral histories, so I felt that they were at least worth mentioning. A number of squash seeds were also found, but unlike corn, was not listed as something being purchased. Perhaps this was something being grown by the residents themselves. Bones from pigs, cows, chickens, and fish also turned up, some of which showed signs of being butchered, giving us some insight into what sort of meat consumption was taking place. Egg and oyster shell fragments were common finds too. Oyster shell can often be used to scrabble, but these were occasionally purchased at the store in quantities more likely for consumption. One of the most purchased food-related items was actually coffee, and a few beans did manage to survive long enough to be cataloged. Ceramics make up a large portion of the collection, and among these were crock fragments. Being utilitarian vessels, they can serve many purposes, one being food storage. Other archaeological evidence of food storage also include mason jar lids, lid liners, and jar fragments. Some of the base fragments showed evidence of burning, so they were likely used for cooking as well. The company store was where a majority of people's supplies would come from. Instead of using money, script was used, so the goods purchased would be deducted directly from the workers' wages. Regarding where the store got its supplies from, prior to Catoctin being connected by rail, products like pig iron and iron castings would be hauled to Frederick or Thurmont to be distributed. Supplies including sugar, molasses, flour, bacon, potatoes, and salt would be brought back to be sold at the store. There was also a nearby grist mill where local farmers would grind their grain to be used by their family and to be sold at the store. 4 months of store ledgers recorded in 4 different years have survived. Many of the aforementioned foods were regular purchases by the laborers. On this page from the February 1882 ledger, we can see that Joseph Miller was purchasing foods like molasses, potatoes, beans, sauerkraut, tomatoes, bacon, syrup, flour, and licorice. Some patterns between the 4 different ledgers began to form. For example, in the January and February ledgers, more produce was being purchased. In May and October, the months of the other 2 ledgers, they were likely growing their own food and may have run out of their stores by the winter months. Conversely, more vinegar was being purchased in May and October because they were pickling and preserving their crops for the winter. Here's a quick breakdown of the most frequently purchased food-related items in January of 1886. In descending order, we have sugar at the top, then coffee, syrup, flour, bacon, beans, cheese, lard, cakes, and potatoes. While pouring through these ledgers, you can see these staple foodstuffs being purchased over and over again, but there were a few entries that stood out. For example, in the 1886 ledger, there was a charge for a telephone message, only 10 years after the telephone had been invented and before they had really become more common by the 1900s. It also appears that someone was practicing their handwriting in one of the pages. There was also this note on George Donnelly's page that read, "Good for nothing. To hell with him done." Perhaps Mr. Donnelly ran off without paying a debt? Having worked retail in the past, it felt very relatable that sometimes there will just be some customers that will just ruin your day. Worm confections was another unique purchase that I found in the ledger from May of 1864. My initial thought was gummy worms, but after some research, it turns out that they were not invented until the 1920s in Germany, and worm confections were actually pills to help rid you of worms, a much more common ailment at the time. In the oral histories, we can learn more about what isn't found in the ledgers. These interviews were conducted by Elizabeth Yerty Anderson, who was a founding member of the Catoctin Furnace Historical Society and played a large role in getting the village listed on the National Register of Historic Places. These recordings were taken in the early to mid-80s with longtime Catoctin residents. Some of the individuals had memories of when the furnace was in operation or had relatives that were employed there. The testimonies of these descendants give us more insight into their lives, what their diets were like, as well as that of the previous generation that we wouldn't have been able to know otherwise. We're fortunate that the topic of food was often brought up, so recipes, farming, foraging, gardening, hunting, and making it through the times when food was scarce were all topics of discussion. Living off the land was an integral part of their lives. This primarily included foraging, hunting, and gardening. Foraging often took place in the summer. Some of the items of interest included blackberries, huckleberries, and tea berries. One individual mentioned that berry picking was a kid's job. There were also a number of different greens, such as watercress, lamb's quarter, plantain leaves, and poke. In case anyone is inspired to start foraging after this presentation, pokeweed is toxic. Young poke picked in the spring is slightly less toxic and can be eaten when prepared properly. Much of the knowledge involved in foraging was likely passed down from previous generations. Foraging was a free source of food that could also be canned and stored for the winter. Some herbs, roots, and barks would also be gathered to be used in teas such as sassafras root, wood betony, and birch bark. Snake root mixed with some whiskey was said to help with digestion. Perhaps some of these teas were drunk out of peafowl spatterware. This fragment, along with several others, were found at the Forgeman's house. This decorative style was very popular in the 1820s to the 1860s. Hunting was another means of food acquisition. The gentlemen in this hunting party were likely a part of a more affluent population at Catoctin. There was not much game in the area, but they hunted what they could, which mostly included rabbits, squirrels, and groundhogs. A sizable portion of their diet was grown in their gardens. Some families placed particular importance on proper planting times in accordance with the signs and the phases of the moon. For example, it was said that if you were to plant onions in the up of the moon, they wouldn't stay in the ground. Or if you were to plant pole beans during the down of the moon, they wouldn't properly climb up the pole even when tied. Here we have the Harriet Orth Garden or historic kitchen garden that was created in Catoctin a few years ago. It's growing historically accurate plants to continue to help educate people on what sorts of foods were cooked and how they were prepared. Fruit butters and spreads were also prepared and canned. These were made with apples, cherries, pears, and peaches. An old apple butter family recipe was recorded a few years ago and was made in a kettle over an open fire by the students from the Silver Oak Academy, so it will be able to be enjoyed by future generations. Silver Oak Academy is a local high school for at-risk students that we often work with to help provide them with job skills and experience that they can take forward into their lives after they graduate. Based on the ledgers, fruit was not often purchased and was likely being grown in the area. There was a letter written by a woman that was sent to her niece living in Catoctin that read, "You spoke of fruit being plenty back there. There isn't any kind of fruit this year out here. I suppose we will have to live on bread and meat and potatoes this winter, for we didn't have anything to put up." Bread and potatoes were staples in their diet, with it sometimes only consisting of these items when times were hard. In an interview with Ethel Devilbliss, she said, "If we didn't have nothing else, we had bread and gravy." Her family would often brown some flour with a little grease and add water to make the gravy and pour it over the bread. Potatoes could be used in making bread and was often used when making pot pies. Other families mention all sorts of pot pies, being made with beans, sausage, beef, and chicken. People would raise their own livestock, as was indicated by the purchasing of ship stuff or feed at the store. Farmers had cows and would sell milk, butter, and cheese, but mostly people raised hogs and chickens. Overall, a number of foodstuffs were purchased at the company store, but a large portion of their diet was supplemented by what they could grow, harvest, forage, or raise for themselves. There was also an emphasis on putting away food to make it through the winter months. What families could not afford, they did without. Thank you for taking the time to listen today. I hope that you're able to learn a little bit more about the foodways at Catoctin Furnace.